Imagine you are standing at the absolute pinnacle of global industrial military power.
Right.
I mean, the year is 1879. You are the British Empire. You are armed with state-of-the-art, breech-loading, rapid-fire rifles.
Yeah, the absolute cutting edge of the time.
Exactly. You have field artillery, you have rockets, and you're backed by this massive, incredibly complex, well-funded military logistics network.
Basically the most powerful machine on the planet.
Right. And then within a matter of hours, on a totally sunny morning in January, your entire expeditionary force is just categorically, utterly annihilated by an indigenous army.
An army armed almost entirely with spears and cowhide shields.
It's wild. Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm so glad you could join us because we are unpacking one of the most stunning military upsets in history, the Battle of Isandlwana.
And honestly, if you look at the military doctrine of the 19th century, what happened there is a mathematical impossibility.
Right, because industrial firepower is supposed to win, like, every single time.
Every time. And yet the mathematics completely broke down.
They really did.
Yeah.
And you're left looking at this historical landscape that is just, well, it's incredibly difficult to process.
You expect to see this clear, simple reason why a modern army failed so catastrophically.
Yeah, but instead you get this massive bleeding contusion of imperial hubris, rigid bureaucracy, and a total failure to understand the environment.
Which is exactly what we're going to get into today.
Right. And to do this, we are drawing on a really fascinating stack of material.
Some great sources for this one.
Oh, absolutely. We're looking at the deeply critical historiography from Daphne Golan's book, Inventing Shaka.
Which is fantastic for helping us understand how these historical narratives are built and, manipulated.
Exactly. And we're pairing that with the incredibly granular, moment-by-moment military breakdown from Ian Castle's Zulu War 1879, Twilight of a Warrior Nation.
It's a perfect pairing, really.
Why do you say that?
Well, because to understand Isandlwana, you have to look at the microscopic details, like literally down to the physical screws on an ammunition box and the macroscopic details.
Right. The political maneuvering happening in offices thousands of miles away in London and Cape Town.
Exactly. You just can't separate the physical slaughter on the battlefield from the cynical politics that engineered it in the first place.
Yeah, the bloodshed didn't just happen by accident. I mean, 1,700 British troops didn't just wander into Zululand and trip over an army.
No, not at all.
So to understand why they were dying in the shadow of this weird sphinx-shaped mountain, we have to rewind. We have to look at what is basically a masterclass in political manipulation.
Okay, so let's set the stage. Let's look at the map of southern Africa in the late 1870s.
Paint the picture for us.
Well, you have the British firmly established in the Natal colony in the south.
Okay.
And to the west, you have the Boers, who are the descendants of Dutch settlers, and they have their own republic in the Transvaal.
Right. And right there, wedged dangerously between these two expanding, land-hungry European powers,
Hemmed in by the Thukulan and Enkam rivers, yeah.
is the independent Zulu Kingdom.
Exactly. Now, the Zulu Kingdom had emerged earlier in the 19th century as this massive regional power under King Shaka.
Right, but by the 1870s, under King Cetshwayo, things are shifting.
Yeah, they are feeling the immense, crushing pressure of European colonial expansion all around them.
And this is where the primary architect of this disaster walks onto the stage. Sir Henry Bartle Frere.
Oh, Frere.
Yeah. He is the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa. He arrives in 1877, and he doesn't just come to, manage the colony.
No, he comes with a massive, region-altering mandate. He was tasked with implementing a policy called confederation.
Confederation, which sounds like a very diplomatic, polite term.
It does, but you have to look at the economic reality driving it.
What was going on economically?
Diamonds had been discovered. Gold was on the horizon. The British wanted a unified, pacified region to control the labor force and secure these massive economic assets.
Ah, so it's always about the money.
Always. Confederation was this grand plan to forcibly unite all the various rival black and white groups across the entire region under a single overarching British authority.
And to Frere, there is one glaring, unacceptable obstacle to this grand design.
King Cetshwayo and the independent Zulu nation.
Right. Because Cetshwayo wasn't just some figurehead, he was actively revitalizing the Zulu state apparatus.
Yeah, he was maintaining a massive, highly organized military structure.
So Frere looks at this independent, powerful African kingdom, and just decides it simply cannot exist if Confederation is going to work.
But Frere has a massive problem with that plan.
His own bosses.
Exactly. The home government back in London, specifically Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's cabinet, absolutely did not want a war in South Africa.
They were busy elsewhere.
Very busy.
Yeah.
If you look at the global geopolitical board at the time, Britain was heavily entangled in a major crisis in the Balkans with the Russian Empire.
Oh, right.
And they were actively fighting a very serious, very bloody war in Afghanistan.
So the absolute last thing London wanted was another expensive, messy, entirely avoidable conflict in Africa.
Precisely. They explicitly told Frere to treat the Zulus with a spirit of forbearance.
So London says, do not start a war.
Yep.
But Frere just decides he's going to start one anyway. How does a colonial administrator completely bypass the Prime Minister of the British Empire?
By exploiting the physical limitations of 19th century technology.
Oh, I love this part. Tell us how.
Specifically, the telegraph and the steamship. You see, there was no direct telegraph line from Cape Town to London in 1878.
Which means communication wasn't instant.
Far from it. A message had to be put on a ship in South Africa, sail all the way up the West African coast to the Cape Verde Islands, or directly to England.
And that took, what, a few days?
No, that took weeks. Frere knew that if he asked for permission, he'd get a definitive no a month later.
Right.
But if he just acted, it would take weeks for London to even find out, and by then, the war would already be underway.
He relied on the communication lag to present London with a fait accompli.
Exactly. He forced their hand.
But he still needs an excuse, right? I mean, he can't just send the army across the river unprovoked without looking like a complete tyrant to the international press.
Right. He needs a casus belli.
And what fascinates me is how he manufactures it out of absolutely nothing.
It's purely cynical.
Huh.
First, he starts a systematic propaganda campaign.
What did that look like?
He starts writing these dispatch reports back to London, painting Cetshwayo as an unstable, bloodthirsty despot.
Okay.
And the specific phrase used in the colonial dispatches to describe the Zulu warriors is just chilling. They called them celibate manslaying machines.
Wow. Celibate manslaying machines, which is such a calculated piece of dehumanization.
It really is.
Because if you can convince the politicians and the public that you aren't fighting a complex sovereign nation with, families and agriculture.
Yeah, that you're just fighting a horde of manslaying machines.
Yeah, exactly. The moral hurdle for wiping them out practically vanishes.
Completely. Then Frere needs a physical incident, and he seizes upon these incredibly minor border infractions.
Like what?
For example, there was a minor Zulu chief named Ntshingwayo. He had a couple of wives who fled across the river into British Natal with their lovers.
Okay.
Ntshingwayo's sons crossed the border, dragged the women back into Zulu land, and executed them according to Zulu customary law.
So it was a localized domestic issue that technically violated the border.
Right. And on another occasion, some British colonial engineers strayed onto a Zulu island in the river and were temporarily detained and questioned as spies before being released unharmed.
So, innocuous incidents, border friction, the kind of things that happen every single week when two nations share a river boundary.
Exactly. But Frere magnifies them. He portrays these incidents as an imminent threat of a full-scale Zulu invasion of Natal.
And he leverages this to issue his ultimatum.
Yes. In December 1878, he summons King Cetshwayo's representatives to the banks of the Thukela River.
And they think they're there for a different reason.
Right. Yeah, they are nominally there to hear the results of a boundary commission regarding a land dispute between the Zulus and the Boers.
And ironically, the British Commission had actually ruled in favor of the Zulus. They basically said the land is yours.
But Frere attaches a poison pill to this ruling. He demands massive reparations for those minor border incidents we talked about.
And then he drops the absolute hammer.
The big one.
He demands the complete, total abandonment of the entire Zulu military system, and he gives Cetshwayo exactly 30 days to comply.
And you have to understand, Frere knew exactly what he was asking. The Zulu military system wasn't just a standing army that you could just defund and send home.
Right, it wasn't like modern troops packing up a base.
No, it was the fundamental organizing principle of their entire society. Demanding its sudden disbandment was demanding the complete dismantling of Zulu culture, marriage, and agriculture.
He knew Cetshwayo couldn't possibly comply within 30 days.
Of course he did. He intentionally engineered a mathematically impossible situation where war was the only outcome.
I think about how often we see this exact same pattern today, whether it's in geopolitics or, honestly, corporate takeovers.
Oh, for sure.
A leader wants to push through a highly unpopular or hostile agenda. So they manufacture a crisis or they exploit a minor vulnerability.
To force the issue.
Right. They create a situation where retreating suddenly seems more costly than just pressing forward.
It's a classic squeeze.
To me, Frere's tactic was like a predatory real estate developer who wants to knock down a historic apartment building to build luxury condos.
Okay, I like this analogy.
He gives the legacy tenants a 24-hour eviction notice, knowing full well they can't physically pack up their lives in that time.
Right?
And then, when they inevitably fail to leave, he calls the police, acts completely shocked, and plays the victim of their quote-unquote trespassing.
Exactly.
This wasn't a tragic clash of civilizations. It was a hostile takeover masked as self-defense.
That is precisely how Daphne Golan approaches it in Inventing Shaka. You have to strip away the later British justifications of civilizing the region.
It was a deliberate, unprovoked land grab. And so the 30 days expire on January 11th, 1879.
And the Zulus obviously do not dismantle their entire civilization.
The ultimatum goes unanswered. Frere has his war.
But once the politicians finish their paperwork, the reality of actually fighting this war falls to the military.
And the moment these two armies actually begin marching toward each other, you realize they aren't just fighting with different weapons.
No, they're operating in entirely different realities of time, space, and movement.
Let's look at the British invasion force first. Who is leading this?
The commander is Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford. He is given the immense task of invading a vast, rugged country with practically no roads.
So what's his strategy?
He decides to divide his forces. He originally wanted 5 columns invading Zulu land from different angles to converge on the capital, Ulundi.
5 columns sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It was. The sheer logistical strain forces him to reduce it to 3 offensive columns.
Now, for our deep dive, we really need to focus on his main thrust, the center column, right?
Yes. The number 3 column, which Chelmsford accompanied personally, this was his strongest force.
And the absolute backbone of this column was the 24th Regiment of Foot. Let's break down who these men actually were.
The 24th Regiment was composed of 2 battalions, and they had very different characters.
Oh, so.
Well, the 1st Battalion was heavily populated with mature, seasoned, long-service veterans.
Okay.
These men were in their late 20s and 30s. They had been in South Africa since 1875.
So they were used to the environment.
Completely. They were thoroughly acclimatized to the heat, the diseases, and the terrain. They had just finished fighting a grinding counterinsurgency campaign against the Xhosa people in the 9th Cape Frontier War.
So the 1st Battalion is a hardened, incredibly cohesive unit.
Very much so. But the 2nd Battalion was different.
What was their deal?
The British Army was undergoing reforms at the time, moving toward a short service system to build up reserves.
Ah, so younger guys.
Exactly. The 2nd Battalion was raised largely in Brecon, in South Wales.
Sure.
So you have a lot of younger men, a much higher proportion of Welsh accents in the ranks,
Right.
and they had significantly less experience in the harsh African bush than their older brothers in the 1st Battalion.
But across the board, these were highly professional, aggressively disciplined British infantrymen.
Absolutely. And visually, they were incredibly striking.
Oh, this is fascinating. Because in 1879, the British Army was in this weird transitional phase, right?
Yeah. Half a world away in the dust of Afghanistan, British troops were actually starting to wear khaki camouflage.
But here in Zululand, they marched to war in their traditional, iconic scarlet red jackets, dark blue trousers, and gleaming white foreign service helmets.
Which, if you think about it, is just painting a massive high-visibility target on your chest.
Literally. And in a landscape dominated by brown dirt and green scrub, a red coat and a bright white helmet is just wild.
Though, Ian Castle's book notes a brilliant detail about those white helmets.
Oh, right, the dyeing.
Yeah. The veterans of the 1st Battalion quickly realized that a bright white dome on your head was a death sentence for a sniper.
So they improvised.
They actually stripped off the shiny brass badges and dyed the white canvas helmets using tea, coffee, or even boiling the bark of mimosa trees.
Just to tone them down to a dusty, dirty brown.
It shows that these men weren't just mindless automatons, they were practical soldiers trying to survive.
Now, we have to look closely at the machinery of their violence. Their primary infantry weapon was the 1871 pattern Martini-Henry rifle. We really need to understand exactly what this weapon was capable of.
This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. The Martini-Henry was a single-shot, breech-loading rifle.
Walk us through how it works.
You pull down a lever behind the trigger guard, the breech block drops. You slide in a massive rolled brass cartridge.
Okay.
Then you pull the lever back up, and you are ready to fire.
And the cartridge it fired was devastating, right?
It was a .450 caliber heavy lead slug backed by 85 grains of black powder. When that bullet hit a human body, it didn't just pierce. It shattered bone and caused massive, horrific exit wounds.
And how far could they shoot with it?
The rifle was technically sighted up to 1,450 yards, but its most effective murderous battle range was around 300 to 400 yards.
So pretty far out, and fast, too.
A trained British infantryman could fire 10 to 12 aimed rounds a minute.
That is a lot of lead going down range. And they had bayonets, obviously.
Yeah, it was topped with a vicious 21-inch triangular socket bayonet that the troops affectionately nicknamed the Lunger.
Just brutal. And they didn't just have rifles, they also brought artillery.
6 7-pounder rifled muzzle-loading guns.
Though, Castle points out a critical mechanical flaw here.
Right. These specific guns were originally designed as light mountain artillery, meant to be broken down and carried by mules.
But for this campaign, they mounted them on heavy, locally built Caffrarian carriages, which completely ruined their mobility.
Yeah, and furthermore, they had a very low muzzle velocity, which drastically reduced the effectiveness of their explosive shells against an enemy moving in open formation.
They also had a hail rocket battery, right?
They did, which was notoriously inaccurate and temperamental.
But the real anchor, the absolute crushing weight around the neck of the British Army, was their logistics.
Oh, the logistics. If you look at the sheer physics of Chelmsford's invasion force, it is staggering.
Give us the numbers.
He required 977 heavy wooden wagons, 56 carts, over 10,000 oxen, 803 horses, and almost 400 mules.
Try to actually visualize that for a second. 1,000 heavy wagons. There are no paved roads in Zululand.
There were barely even dirt tracks.
Right. It is a landscape of rocky hills, deep ravines, and muddy marshland intersected by rivers with steep vertical banks.
Every time they reached a river, they had to send engineers forward to literally dynamite and dig away the steep banks.
Just to create a slope gradual enough for a wagon to slide down and be hauled up the other side?
Exactly. And each wagon was pulled by a span of up to 18 massive oxen.
And oxen are incredibly fragile logistical engines, aren't they?
Very fragile. They can only work for a few hours a day. They need up to 16 hours a day just to graze on the sparse grass and rest.
Or else
they will literally lay down in the yoke and die.
So the British column wasn't an agile military force. It was a crawling, agonizingly slow, incredibly fragile industrial city on wooden wheels.
If you calculate the physical space of 1,000 wagons and 10,000 animals marching in single file, the column would stretch for miles.
Castle notes that even on a perfect day, on flat ground, they might make 10 miles. In bad weather, it was measured in mere miles per week.
Now contrast that massive, heavy, creaking machinery with the Zulu army.
Right. Totally different universe.
To understand the Zulus, we have to refer back to the sociological insights in Inventing Shaka.
What do we need to know?
The Zulu military was not a professional standing institution in the European sense, where you sign up for 4 years and live in a fort.
It was a completely integrated armed citizenry.
Yes. It was a system based entirely on age-grade regiments, known as amabutho.
And here's how it worked. When youths across the entire kingdom reached the age of 18 or 19, King Cetshwayo would call them together.
He would form them into a specific ibutho, a regiment, and give them a name.
And then he would assign them a district where they literally built their own barracks, an ikanda.
And the discipline was intensely societal. The most critical element of the amabutho system was the marriage law.
This part is fascinating to me.
Warriors were strictly forbidden from marrying until the king specifically gave their entire regiment permission to do so.
Which usually didn't happen until the men were in their late 30s.
Right.
Now, the British propaganda at the time claimed this artificial prolongation of bachelorhood was a sinister plot by the king to channel sexual frustration into pure military aggression.
Yeah, they loved that narrative.
They really did.
But it's a profound misunderstanding of Zulu economics and statecraft.
Because to the Zulus, it was more practical than that.
The Zulus simply saw it as a way to maximize the period of national service. While unmarried, these men were effectively the state labor force.
They policed the nation, they built the royal homesteads, they managed the king's massive herds of cattle, and they fought its wars.
And it created incredibly close, fiercely loyal bonds between the men of the same regiment. They ate together, danced together, and trained together for decades.
So when mobilized, this system was terrifyingly efficient. Let's look at their logistics. How many wagons did the Zulu army bring?
Zero.
None.
They required no baggage trains. They could march 20 miles a day over the roughest terrain imaginable,
Which is double the British speed on a good day.
and twice that distance if it was a forced march.
Unbelievable. What do they eat?
For the first few days of a campaign, they might be accompanied by young boys, Udibi boys, carrying sleeping mats, corn, and beer.
Okay.
But after that, they lived entirely by foraging and driving small herds of cattle with them. They were light, organic, and incredibly fast.
And visually, they were a masterpiece of organization.
Absolutely.
For everyday battle dress, they wore a simple belt of hide and a square of softened cowhide over the buttocks. But the true identifier, the uniform of a Zulu warrior, was his large, oval, cowhide war shield.
And this wasn't just for deflecting spears. It was a highly sophisticated visual command and control system.
Explain how that worked.
The king's herdsmen carefully matched the hides for each regiment. Young, unmarried, fast-moving regiments carried almost entirely black shields.
Okay, so black shields mean the young guys.
Right. As a regiment aged and gained experience, their shields incorporated more white. Senior, veteran, married regiments carried pure white or red shields.
So a Zulu commander could stand on a ridge, look across a valley 3 miles wide, and instantly know exactly which specific units were deployed on his left or right flank.
Based purely on the color of the shields moving through the tall grass.
That is brilliant.
It really is. Now, their primary weapon was the ikwa, the iconic stabbing spear introduced by King Shaka 50 years earlier.
Tell us about the ikwa.
It had a massive, broad iron blade, 12 to 18 inches long, mounted on a stout wooden shaft.
So it wasn't meant to be thrown?
No, it was designed specifically for a powerful underarm thrust in brutal close-quarters shock combat.
They also carried a few lighter throwing spears, the assegai, to disrupt the enemy line before closing in.
Right. Now, Ian Castle does note that by 1879, the Zulus had actually acquired a huge number of firearms.
They had, largely through illicit trade and smuggling through Delagoa Bay.
But the British observers correctly noted that these were mostly obsolete percussion cap models or antique Brown Bess muskets from the Napoleonic Wars.
Usually in terrible condition.
Very terrible. More importantly, the Zulus had no formal training in European marksmanship. They tended to fire high.
And they had no standardized ammunition supply, right?
Exactly, relying on whatever powder and lead they could scavenge or cast themselves, and they had no spare parts.
So in a sheer firefight, they could not possibly match British breech-loading firepower.
But the crucial point is, they never intended to fight a European-style firefight.
Right. Tactically, the entire Zulu army was wedded to a single, hyper-aggressive maneuver known as Impondo Zankomo, the beast's horns.
It is a brilliantly simple, devastatingly effective tactical formation. The entire army operates as a single organism divided into 4 parts.
How does it deploy?
The chest is composed of the heaviest, most seasoned regiments.
Yeah.
They advance straight ahead to engage and pin the enemy in a massive frontal assault.
Okay, that's the chest.
Meanwhile, the 2 horns, usually the youngest, fastest, fittest regiments, sprint out on either side in a wide flanking maneuver to completely encircle the enemy.
And the 4th part?
Finally, the loins remain seated on the ground in the rear as a tactical reserve.
Seated? Really?
Yeah, literally sitting, waiting for the commander to order them forward to exploit a weakness or pursue a broken enemy.
It is a system optimized for one thing: closing the distance as fast as humanly possible and engaging in hand-to-hand combat. Now, I want to point out a truly tragic irony here regarding the troops fighting alongside the British. Lord Chelmsford's force included the Natal Native Contingent, the NNC.
Ah, yes, the NNC.
These were local black Africans from Natal, largely from tribes hostile to the Zulu Kingdom, recruited to fight for the British.
But the deep-seated colonial paranoia of the white authorities in Natal meant they were absolutely terrified of arming a large black force, even if they were allies.
The treatment of the NNC is a glaring example of how racism actively undermines military effectiveness.
The sources show their white officers and non-commissioned officers were often drawn from the dregs of colonial society.
Men who didn't even speak the language and despised their own troops.
Yes. Only 1 man in 10 in the NNC was even trusted with a firearm, and it was usually an obsolete piece of junk.
And here's the truly shocking, fatal detail. The men who did have rifles were issued exactly 4 rounds of ammunition per man.
4 bullets.
4 bullets for an entire campaign. They had no uniforms. They were distinguished from the enemy only by a red rag tied around their heads. It's absurd.
So you have this stark contrast. On one side, the British column. A massive, incredibly slow, heavily armed, bureaucratically rigid machine chained to 1,000 ox-wagons.
Right.
On the other side, the Zulu army, a hyper-agile, brilliantly lean, deeply unified organism that can move twice as fast and requires almost zero logistical support.
To use a modern analogy, it's like a bloated legacy corporate giant trying to outmaneuver a hyper-agile tech startup.
Exactly. The British brought all their corporate infrastructure with them, while the Zulus ran a perfectly lean operation.
That fundamental contrast in mobility, logistics, and philosophy is the underlying engine of the entire campaign.
And it perfectly sets the stage for the disastrous series of decisions made by the British commander.
Because Chelmsford's inability to comprehend the speed and discipline of the army he was facing led directly to the fatal advance.
Let's track Chelmsford's movements. On January 11, 1879, the ultimatum expires, and the center column crosses the Mizanyathi River into Zululand at a place called Rorke's Drift.
The invasion has officially begun. And initially, for the first few days, things go exactly according to the Victorian colonial script.
They launch an attack on a stronghold belonging to that local Zulu chief, Cetshwayo.
The one whose sons crossed the border?
Right. Cetshwayo's warriors were positioned defensively in a steep gorge.
And what happens?
The British infantry, heavily supported by the NNC, conduct a textbook frontal assault. They climb the cliffs, pour controlled rifle fire into the caves, and clear the stronghold after a brief, sharp skirmish.
They capture cattle and burn the homestead. It is an easy, clean victory with minimal British casualties.
But that easy victory was absolute poison for Chelmsford's tactical judgment.
How so?
It acted as an intense dose of confirmation bias. It completely solidified what he already believed, that African warriors, no matter how brave, simply could not stand up to disciplined, concentrated British firepower.
We really need to analyze Chelmsford's psychology here. Let's play devil's advocate for a moment on his behalf.
Sure.
Chelmsford was not an idiot. He was a highly experienced career soldier.
Very much so. He had literally just finished fighting the 9th Cape Frontier War against the Xhosa.
And standard Victorian military doctrine for colonial warfare, based on decades of experience across the globe, dictated that indigenous forces would usually scatter from artillery and concentrated rifle fire.
The Xhosa employed elusive, hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. They fought from thickly wooded mountains and deep river valleys.
They actively avoided pitched, open-ground battles against the Redcoats.
And Chelmsford mistakenly projected that exact same Xhosa behavior onto the Zulus.
He looked at the terrain and assumed the Zulu army would operate the exact same way.
He was absolutely convinced that the Zulus would avoid a direct frontal confrontation against his camp.
In his mind, his biggest problem wasn't surviving a Zulu attack. His biggest problem was going to be catching them before they melted away into the hills.
Exactly. His entire mindset was offensive, not defensive. Which brings us to the arrival at Isandlwana on January 20th.
The lumbering, miles-long ox-wagon column crests a rise, and there before them is this massive, striking, sphinx-shaped mountain.
Mount Isandlwana.
The British set up their camp along the eastern foot of this mountain, on a gentle slope leading down to a plain.
And here is where Chelmsford makes the defining error of his career.
He deliberately, consciously ignores standard operating procedures for the British Army operating in hostile South African territory.
The standard procedure, especially when you are an invading force, heavily outnumbered, and hauling a massive supply train, was to establish a laager.
Explain what a laager is.
You draw all those hundreds of heavy wooden wagons into a tight circle, chain them together, fill the gaps with thorn bushes, and create a formidable, mobile, wooden fortress.
And if you don't have time for that?
The absolute minimum requirement is to order your men to dig trenches and throw up earthworks to entrench the perimeter of the camp.
But Chelmsford doesn't do either. He doesn't laager the wagons. He doesn't order a single trench dug.
His own subordinate, Colonel Glynn, officially suggests laagering the camp, but Chelmsford specifically overrules him.
He leaves the camp completely open, with tents spread out for nearly a mile along the base of the mountain. Why?
Because he wanted to tempt the Zulus into an attack.
He firmly believed that if he built a fortified laager, the Zulus would look at it, realize it was impregnable, and just walk around it, denying him the decisive battle he was desperate to fight.
It is a stunning, almost pathological display of hubris.
And he was warned, too. Ian Castle's text points out that Chelmsford consistently, repeatedly disregarded the advice of local colonial commanders, Boers, and frontiersmen who actually knew the country.
Men who intimately knew Zulu tactics. Paul Kruger, the famous Boer leader, had
Yeah.
explicitly warned him to laager his wagons every single night.
But Chelmsford assumed his regular imperial troops were fundamentally invincible in the open field.
Right.
I look at this and I try to find a modern equivalent. It's like a bank manager deciding to leave the massive steel vault door wide open overnight.
Oh, man.
And maybe leaving stacks of cash on the lobby counter because he assumes that the sheer reputation and prestige of the bank's name will keep the robbers away.
It's an arrogance so deep, it actively overrides basic survival instincts.
And this blinding confirmation bias leads directly to his second fatal mistake.
On the afternoon of January 21st, British scouting patrols report a few hundred Zulus moving in the rugged hills miles away to the southeast, near the Magini Gorge.
And Chelmsford immediately jumps to a conclusion.
He is convinced this is the vanguard of the main Zulu army, and that they are trying to slip past him to avoid a fight.
So at dawn on January 22nd, he makes the disastrous decision to split his force.
He takes more than half of the center column, including the highly experienced 2nd Battalion of the 24th Regiment, 4 of his artillery pieces, and most of his cavalry.
And he marches out into the hills to hunt down what he thinks is the main enemy force.
He essentially takes his sword out into the dark to chase a shadow, and he leaves his shield completely behind.
He leaves the sprawling, unfortified camp at Isandlwana under the command of Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pullein.
Now, Pullein was a solid officer, but he was an administrator. He was a staff officer, a man used to managing logistics and paperwork, not an experienced combat commander used to maneuvering troops under heavy fire.
And shortly after marching out, Chelmsford sends a message ordering reinforcements up from Rorke's Drift to Isandlwana.
These reinforcements are commanded by Brevet Colonel Anthony Durnford.
Durnford is one of the most fascinating, tragic figures in this entire narrative.
He really is. The sources describe him as highly controversial, fiercely intelligent, and deeply impetuous.
And uniquely for a British officer of his time, he admired and genuinely respected the indigenous black population.
His command consisted almost entirely of African troops, specifically the mounted men of the native horse.
But Durnford had a very strained relationship with Chelmsford, who had recently censured him for disobeying orders.
And physically, Durnford was striking. He had a completely paralyzed left arm from an assegai wound in a previous skirmish years earlier,
which he wore tucked into the breast of his tunic. He could only ride and shoot with one hand.
He was incredibly brave, but he was headstrong.
So you have Pullein, a cautious administrator who has been explicitly told to strictly defend the camp, and Durnford, a restless, aggressive cavalry officer who technically outranks Pullein.
Arriving at this completely unfortified, sprawling camp.
The camp is fundamentally divided in leadership. Chelmsford is miles away in the hills, aggressively chasing ghosts.
And while the British commander is out hunting the enemy, a routine patrol sent out from the camp is about to stumble into an absolute nightmare.
Which brings us to the moment of discovery.
When Durnford arrives at Isandlwana, he is not content to just sit in the tents.
No, of course not.
Hearing vague reports of Zulus on the high ground of the north, he decides to ride out and investigate.
He sends his mounted troops, the native horse, fanning out across the high grassy plateau to the north of the camp, the Nkwuthu Plateau, to sweep for the enemy.
One of these small mounted troops is commanded by a young officer named Lieutenant Raw.
They are riding about 4 miles from the camp, sweeping through the tall grass. They spot a small herd of cattle being driven by a handful of Zulus.
Now, cattle are the absolute currency of the region, so capturing them is a priority.
Thinking this is just a local herdsman trying to hide his wealth, Raw and his men give chase. The Zulus disappear over a slight fold in the ground, heading toward a deep, hidden valley.
Raw and his men spur their horses forward, galloping up to the very edge of the plateau.
The ground drops sharply away in front of them into the deep, rocky, steep-sided valley of the Ngwebeni.
And as Lieutenant Raw rides up to the lip of the escarpment and looks down, he violently hauls back on his reins.
I want you to picture the sheer, visceral shock of this moment.
Yeah, try to put yourself there.
It is high noon. The African sun is beating down. It's hot. The cicadas are buzzing. Raw looks down into this hidden ravine.
And sitting there, packed shoulder to shoulder in absolute deathly silence, is the main Zulu impi. 20,000 warriors.
20,000.
It's crucial to understand why they were there, and more importantly, why they were sitting in total silence.
Right. Because the Zulu military machine had completely outmaneuvered Lord Chelmsford.
While Chelmsford was looking for them in the southeast, the Zulu commanders had force-marched 20,000 men right to the very doorstep of the British camp,
hiding them in a ravine 4 miles away, entirely undetected by British cavalry screens.
But if they were right there, why hadn't they attacked at dawn? Why were they just sitting there?
Because of deeply held ritual reasons, January 22nd was the day of the new moon.
In Zulu cosmology, this was an inauspicious dark day, a day of resting and transition.
The senior Zulu commanders, Chief Manyamana and Chief Ntshingwayo kaMahole, had absolutely no intention of fighting that day.
Their plan was to keep the army hidden, complete their ritual purifications, and then launch a massive, coordinated dawn assault on the British camp the following morning, the 23rd.
So you have 20,000 men, a human ocean of muscle, hide shields, and iron spears sitting quietly in a ravine waiting for tomorrow.
And suddenly, the skyline above them on the lip of the ravine is broken by British horsemen.
Lieutenant Ra's scouts look down at the army. The Zulu army looks up at the scouts.
And this is where the sheer, ingrained discipline of the Zulu military machine takes over.
What happens next?
The Zulu regiment sitting closest to the horsemen was the Kondempemvu regiment. The absolute moment they realized they had been discovered, they didn't look to their generals for orders.
They didn't wait for a command.
The sources state that the senior Indunas, the commanders like Ntshingwayo, were completely powerless to stop them.
The Kondempemvu instinctively sprang to their feet, and the moment that one regiment moved, the entire 20,000-man army erupted.
Now, I need to stop and emphasize the physical mechanics of
Yeah, please. Because without a single bugle call, without a radio transmission, without a general standing on a hill waving flags, how does a mass of 20,000 human beings instantly coordinate a complex tactical maneuver across miles of broken terrain?
It speaks entirely to the brilliance of the amabutho system we discussed earlier. These men hadn't just met at a recruitment depot a month ago.
Right, they lived together.
They had lived together, drilled together, and existed as a single, cohesive unit for years. The beast's horns formation wasn't just a tactic they had memorized on a chalkboard. It was an ingrained physical reflex.
So when the Kondempemvu sprang up, the organism simply executed its defensive predatory posture.
They relied on visual cues, the color of the shields moving around them, and the localized leadership of our regimental subcommanders.
The Kondempemvu and elements of the Umixhapo instantly formed the chest, driving straight up the steep slopes toward the scouts.
The Umbonambi, Ingobamakosi, and UV regiments immediately peeled off to the left, running at a dead sprint to form the left horn.
The Udodudu, Imbube, and Izankru hooked wide to the right to form the right horn.
Only the veteran Undikor, the oldest men, had the discipline to hold themselves back as the reserve, the loins.
It's an awe-inspiring display of command and control. Imagine Ra's perspective. You open what you think is a quiet closet door in an empty house to chase a mouse, and you find a Category 5 hurricane raging inside.
That's a great way to put it.
And the hurricane instantly reaches out to grab you. They surged up the slopes of the valley like a black tidal wave, spilling over the edge of the plateau, heading straight for the British camp.
Ra and his men wheel their horses around and gallop for their lives back toward Isandlwana, firing their carbines into the air to raise the alarm.
Which brings us to the actual collapse of the British position.
The men in the unfortified camp at Isandlwana hear the distant popping of carbines.
They look up at the Nukwuthu escarpment, and they suddenly see a tide of humanity pouring over the skyline.
A front line of warriors miles wide, moving at a relentless jog.
But initially, despite the shock of seeing 20,000 men materializing out of nowhere, the British command thought their technology would save them.
They truly believed that if they just set up a firing line, the Martini-Henry would do the rest.
They were catastrophically wrong. Let's trace the minute-by-minute tactical breakdown.
When Colonel Pillane realizes the camp is under a massive attack, he deploys the 6 companies of the 24th Regiment he has left.
But here is the fatal consequence of Chelmsford's failure to laager.
Because the tents are spread out over a huge area, and because there are no trenches to fall back into, Pillane pushes his infantry out to form a firing line very far ahead of the camp itself.
He is trying to hold a perimeter nearly 2 miles long with fewer than 1,000 regular infantry.
Which mathematically means the men are spread incredibly thin. Instead of standing shoulder to shoulder, there are gaps of several yards between each soldier.
But at first, the industrial machine works.
It does. As the Zulu chest bounds down from the plateau, the British officers bark the orders. The Martini-Henry rifles unleash devastating, coordinated volley fire.
The sound must have been deafening.
The heavy .450 caliber lead bullets tear into the Zulu ranks at 400 yards. The volley fire is so disciplined, so continuous, and so murderous that the sheer physics of the lead actually stalls the advance of the Zulu chest.
The warriors realize they cannot run upright into that storm of metal.
So they throw themselves down into the tall grass, pinning themselves to the earth.
British survivors later describe the sound of the Zulu chest, pinned down in the grass, humming and murmuring like a swarm of angry bees.
So the chest is pinned. The British think they are winning.
But the beast's horns are still moving, running at a dead sprint around the flanks.
And this is where Colonel Durnford's aggressive instincts doom the camp.
Remember Durnford rode out earlier?
He ends up far out on the right flank, separated from the main British line, down in a deep, dry riverbed, a donga.
Durnford and his mounted men dismount and fight fiercely from the lip of the donga, pouring fire into the advancing Zulu left horn.
But the geography of the donga betrays them. The Zulu left horn is so massive and moving so fast that they simply flow around Durnford's position.
Durnford's men realize they are about to be completely cut off and surrounded.
They mount up and begin a desperate fighting retreat back toward the main camp.
And Durnford's retreat causes a fatal domino effect.
As Durnford falls back, the infantry companies of the 24th on the far right of Pulane's line suddenly find their flank completely exposed to the Zulu left horn.
To avoid being surrounded themselves, they have to step back and bend their line.
As they bend, the next company has to shift to maintain contact. The rigid British firing line begins to stretch, warp, and fall back.
And it is precisely at this critical moment of immense tactical stress, as the line is warping and the men are firing as fast as they can work the levers of their rifles, that the British administrative bureaucracy catastrophically, lethally fails them.
This is the part of the battle that absolutely haunts me.
The men in the thin firing line have been shooting relentlessly for nearly an hour. The Martini-Henry fires rapidly, and the men are burning through the 70 rounds in their leather pouches.
The barrels of their rifles are searing hot. They are shouting for more ammunition.
Runners, young drummer boys, and NCOs are sent sprinting back to the camp, running nearly a mile through the maze of tents, wagons, and terrified oxen to get more boxes of ammunition from the reserves.
But the camp is a logistical nightmare.
Because the wagons weren't organized.
Right. Chelmsford had amassed nearly 1,000 wagons, but they weren't organized for a desperate defense. They were parked haphazardly.
The runners arrive at the wagons, breathless, panicked, under the sound of distant gunfire, and they can't easily find their specific regimental supply wagons.
And when they do find a wagon with ammunition, they run into the quartermasters.
The quartermasters, the men whose sole job is to guard the supplies.
The historical record highlights a chilling administrative failure here. The runners demand ammunition for the men dying on the line.
And the quartermasters, strictly bound by rigid, peacetime, Victorian bureaucratic regulations, refuse to issue ammunition to men who are not in their specific regiment or company.
The source text explicitly states, the infantry quartermasters would not issue ammunition to levies.
So if a runner from the native contingent asked a 24th Regiment quartermaster for bullets, he was told to go find his own wagon.
It is the ultimate failure of a system prioritizing its own rules over the reality of the crisis.
You have men literally dying on the firing line, and the supply officers are essentially checking paperwork and demanding proper requisition protocols.
Unbelievable.
I want to use an analogy here to ground this because it's so infuriating. It is exactly like someone bleeding out in the emergency room from a severed artery.
Okay.
And the hospital pharmacist refuses to hand over the bags of O-negative blood because the trauma surgeon hasn't filled out a triplicate requisition form in blue ink.
Yeah, that's exactly what it's like. The rules of the system completely blinded the administrators to the existential reality of the crisis.
And even when the quartermasters did agree to hand over the ammunition, the physical design of the technology failed them.
The British Reserve ammunition was packed in heavy, thick mahogany boxes.
And they weren't easy to open, were they?
No, these boxes were sealed shut with 2 thick copper bands, secured with 9 sliding screws that had often rusted shut during the sea voyage.
9 screws?
9. They were designed to survive being dropped off a ship or a wagon, not to be opened in 5 seconds under heavy fire.
The quartermasters often had the only specialized screwdriver required to slide the bands off.
Desperate soldiers were trying to smash the thick mahogany boxes open with the butts of their rifles, splintering the wood, scattering the cartridges in the dirt.
The user experience of getting the bullets out of the box completely failed in an emergency.
And the Zulus sensed this breakdown instantly.
Because technology is only as good as the logistics delivering it.
Right. As the ammunition flow to the firing line dried up, the devastating crash of the British volleys began to slow down.
It turned into a ragged, sputtering pop, pop, pop as men ran out of bullets.
Down in the grass, A Zulu commander of the Mpemvu regiment realizes the lead storm is slackening.
He stands up in the grass, exposing himself to fire, and shouts a challenge to his men.
He goads them into action.
Yeah.
And the entire Mpemvu regiment rises from the earth with a massive roar and surges forward at a sprint.
The impi bursts through the thinned, exhausted, out-of-ammunition British line.
The moment the Zulus closed the distance and got inside the 21-inch reach of the bayonets, the disciplined European firefight ended.
It instantly devolved into a horrific, brutal, chaotic hand-to-hand slaughter among the canvas tents and the wooden wagons.
The visual descriptions of this climax from the few survivors are apocalyptic.
The British line shatters into desperate, isolated knots of men fighting back-to-back with bayonets and rifle butts against a sea of stabbing spears.
And right at the absolute height of this carnage, the universe itself seems to physically react to the slaughter.
A literal solar eclipse begins.
It is an incredible historical detail. The sky darkens over Mount Isandlwana in the middle of the afternoon.
The temperature drops. The shadow of the moon sweeps over the battlefield.
Ian Castle's book subtitle is literally Twilight of a Warrior Nation, and the destruction of the British camp happens in a literal, eerie, darkening twilight.
The British camp completely collapses. The Zulu left and right homes finally meet behind the camp, closing the circle, completely cutting off the main road back to Rorke's Drift.
The thousands of men, British regulars, NNC, camp followers, who managed to escape the immediate slaughter among the tents, are forced into a desperate blind flight.
They run down a steep, rocky, incredibly treacherous ravine that became known as Fugitives Trail, heading for the flooded Mzinyathi River.
And the Zulus pursued them relentlessly. It was a running massacre.
And it is here, amidst this chaotic flight, that we get one of the most poignant, desperate stories of the entire Victorian era.
The flight of Lieutenants Melville and Coghill.
Tell us about them.
Well, the 24th Regiment, like all British infantry regiments of the era, carried a Queen's color.
Which is a deeply symbolic, richly embroidered silk flag representing their loyalty, their honor, and the monarch herself.
Right. To lose the color to the enemy was the ultimate regimental disgrace.
As the camp completely disintegrated, Lieutenant Melville, the battalion adjutant, was ordered by Colonel Pillane to take the color and save it.
Melville fights his way through the collapsing camp, manages to secure a horse, grabs the heavy-cased flag, and plunges down the tortuous, rocky escape route of Fugitives Trail.
He is joined in the flight by Lieutenant Coghill, who had injured his knee earlier and couldn't walk.
The terrain is brutal. Horses are breaking their legs. Zulus are stabbing men as they run.
They finally reach the steep banks of the Mzinyathi River, but the river is swollen, raging, and flooded from recent rains.
They have no choice. They plunge their exhausted horses into the raging water.
Coghill actually makes it across safely to the Natal bank. He is safe.
But Melville's horse is shot in the water.
He is pulled under by the current and clings to a large rock midstream, desperately trying to hold on to the heavy, waterlogged silk flag, while Zulus on the bank hurl spears at him.
Coghill, sitting on his horse on the safe side of the river, sees his friend drowning. He doesn't hesitate.
He turns his horse around and rides back into the flooded river into a hail of spears to help Melville.
But almost immediately, Coghill's horse is shot out from under him.
Melville is entirely exhausted. He cannot hold the weight of the waterlogged flag anymore.
The Queen's color slips from his grasp and is swept away down the churning river.
Both men manage to scramble and swim onto the rocky Natal bank. They are exhausted, unarmed, soaking wet, and they have lost the flag they died to save.
They stagger a few yards up the steep slope, but the pursuing Zulus plunge into the river, cross over, hunt them down in the rocks, and kill them both.
Weeks later, a patrol found the color washed up on a sandbank downstream.
And years later, when the rules regarding posthumous awards were changed, Melville and Coghill were among the very first to be awarded the Victoria Cross for their bravery.
It is a story of incredible personal heroism. But individual bravery couldn't change the cold mathematics of the day.
Back at the camp at Isandlwana, the fighting finally stopped. It was over.
Out of roughly 1,700 men in the camp, not a single company of the 24th Regiment survived. They were wiped out to the man.
By the end of the eclipse, only about 60 white soldiers and 400 black colonial troops managed to escape across the river. Everyone else, over 1,300 men, was dead.
Which brings us to the haunting aftermath of this disaster. Because while 1,300 men were dying in the shadow of the Sphinx, Lord Chelmsford, the commander who engineered this entire situation, was still miles away in the hills, completely oblivious.
Throughout the day, Chelmsford had actually received numerous warnings.
Warnings he ignored, right?
Officers with him heard the distant, continuous booming of the artillery. He received scribbled notes via courier from Pillane stating that the camp was threatened.
A naval officer with a telescope even spotted Zulus moving among the tents.
But Chelmsford ignored all of it.
His confirmation bias was so blindingly strong that he simply could not physically conceive that the Zulus would attack his unfortified base.
He dismissed the reports, convincing himself that the fighting was just a minor skirmish and that the main Zulu army was still hiding in the hills right in front of him.
It wasn't until late in the afternoon when a lone, exhausted, terrified survivor rode up to Chelmsford's position and bluntly convinced him that the camp was gone, that the reality shattered his illusions.
He was thunderstruck. He hastily gathers his exhausted men and begins a long, slow, agonizing march back toward Isandlwana in the fading light.
I cannot fathom the psychological weight of that march.
Yeah. Chelmsford leads his men back into the valley of Isandlwana long after night has fallen.
They stumble blindly through the absolute darkness. They trip over the shredded canvas of the tents. The wagons are smashed to splinters.
And everywhere, thickly carpeting the ground, are the bodies of their friends.
The scene they encountered in the dark was devastating.
The bodies of the British soldiers had been stripped naked and entirely disemboweled.
Now, to the Victorian British soldiers stumbling over them, this looked like the ultimate act of savage, hateful mutilation.
But we have to understand the cultural context here. It was a deeply ingrained Zulu spiritual practice.
What was the belief behind it?
The Zulus believed that as a corpse bloated with gases in the heat, the spirit of the deceased would be trapped inside, and that trapped spirit would drive the killer to madness.
So slicing the abdomen released the spirit and protected the warrior. But the British soldiers didn't know that theology. They just saw a scene from absolute hell.
And because they knew the Zulu army was still somewhere in the darkness around them, Chelmsford could not risk a night march back to the river.
He forced his surviving men to lie down, form a hollow square, and sleep on the battlefield in the pitch black.
Literally surrounded by the horrific, mutilated wreckage of the men they had breakfast with that morning.
The mental state of Lord Chelmsford at that moment must have been unimaginably bleak.
He was sitting in the dirt, walking through the physical, bloody ruins of his own arrogance.
Every dead body he tripped over was a testament to his failure to entrench, his failure to listen to local advice, his complete failure to respect the capabilities of his enemy.
His entire invasion plan was broken in a single afternoon.
And the nightmare wasn't quite over.
Because the Zulu Reserve Force, the Loins, the Undi Corps, led by the king's brother, Prince Tabulamanzi, had sat out the Battle of Isandlwana.
They were fresh, and they were angry that they had missed out on the glory and the plunder.
So in direct, blatant defiance of King Cetshwayo's strict orders not to cross the border into British territory, these 4,000 reserves marched down to the river.
They crossed into Natal and attacked a tiny British hospital and supply depot at a mission station called Rorke's Drift that very night.
This leads to the famous defense of Rorke's Drift, where a little over 100 British soldiers behind mealie bags and biscuit boxes held off 4,000 Zulus in 10 hours of relentless close-quarters night fighting.
It yielded 11 Victoria Crosses.
But that tiny, desperate tactical victory could not mask the sheer strategic scale of the disaster that had occurred miles away at Isandlwana.
When the news of Isandlwana finally reached Britain by steamship on February 11th, it hit the public and the government like an absolute thunderbolt.
The public was gripped by panic, shock, and outrage.
The government, remember, Disraeli's government that had explicitly ordered Frere not to start this war was absolutely furious.
But they were politically trapped. They couldn't just fire Frere, recall the army, and walk away.
Because the fundamental myth of European imperial invincibility had just been violently publicly shattered on the world stage.
An indigenous army armed with spears had just wiped out a modern, heavily armed British regiment in open combat.
To save face, to maintain the fragile illusion of imperial supremacy across their other colonies, the British government was forced to pivot.
They sent massive reinforcements, thousands of troops, more artillery, Gatling guns, cavalry to South Africa.
He had to crush the Zulu nation, not for security, but purely for prestige and revenge.
Isandlwana proved, in the most brutal, bloody way possible, that industrial might and technological superiority cannot replace situational awareness, basic tactical procedure, and a fundamental respect for your enemy.
It is a timeless lesson, which brings us to how we process this today.
Because the battle ending on the field is really just the beginning of how we understand it.
And this brings us back to Daphne Golan's Inventing Shaka and the concept of historiography. History is not an objective reality. It is a construction.
Exactly. For decades, for nearly a century, the British Empire completely controlled the narrative of this battle.
If you read the London papers from 1879 or the histories written in the 1920s, they painted Isandlwana purely as a tragic, heroic, unavoidable massacre by a horde of bloodthirsty savages.
They focused endlessly on the heroism of Melville and Cog Hill or the defense of Rorke's Drift.
And why did they do that? To purposefully mask their own unprovoked, cynical aggression.
To cover up Chelmsford's gross tactical incompetence and hubris.
If you focus all the blame on the overwhelming savagery of the enemy, you don't have to look at the catastrophic failures of your own leadership, your own supply chains, and your own bureaucratic systems.
But when you actually read the sources critically, when you strip away the layers of colonial propaganda and look at the Zulu internal organization.
Isandlwana wasn't just a British defeat. It was a triumph of Zulu discipline.
It was a masterpiece of agile, organic military execution, completely dismantling rigid industrial arrogance.
The Zulus didn't win by accident. They won by being faster, better coordinated, and exploiting the massive errors of the British commander.
Absolutely.
And so I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We look at history and we expect clean lines. We expect the good guys, the bad guys, the clear reasons why things failed.
But those lines are drawn by whoever holds the pen.
Exactly. The next time you are reading an article about a stunning failure, a shocking political upset in the news, a massive corporate collapse, or a historical disaster, ask yourself, are you reading the story of the side that made the catastrophic mistake? Or are you reading the true story of the side that brilliantly, systematically forced them into it, whose narrative is constructing your reality?